Welcome patrons to this month's terrain tutorial. On this month's tutorial, we're going to be using 1/2-inch insulation foam to create a stone floor. The tools for this project are going to involve the Proxxon foam cutter as well as the 2.0 glide slide from Shifting Lands. These products, while not necessarily necessary to do this, are certainly going to make this project a lot easier and the cuts more consistent. If you don't have them, you can replicate the cuts and all the measurements using hand tools, and it will be quite simple. Just follow along and you'll be able to insert where and when you need to change the appropriate tool. For this, like I said, we're going to be using the 1/2-inch insulation foam. One of the things that we want to do is establish our sizing. For this, we're going to make it really simple. We're going to create some 1-inch by 1-inch foam tiles, but in order to do that, we need to start ripping down our bulk material. You're going to see me run these through the cutter. We're going to first create the strips, and then we're going to bisect them down into the smaller and smaller sections to get our tiles. Let's set up the slide. Setting up the glide slide is quite easy and a really important part of this process. If you don't have a glide slide, you can simply use the Proxxon cutter's guide that it comes with. I don't like it because it's a little bit low and it tends to deflect a little bit more than the MDF. However, it does work and it simply follows the same steps I'm going to show you here. Using the ruler, that's the known quantity of 1-inch by 1-inch. I'm going to go ahead and set the distance between the wire and the backing glide. Next thing I'm going to do is make sure that my foam is going to fit, make sure it's going to fit through and cut me the number of strips that I need. In this case, I'm only going to get 2 strips out of this particular piece. However, that's perfectly fine. You also want to make sure that your foam is free of obstruction, make sure that it slides through, and make sure that you can slide it all the way through and along the length of the piece. In this case, I have the camera in the way, so I'm just going to do shortcuts. In addition, before you start cutting, you're going to want to make sure that your foam cutter is set to the appropriate heat. In this case, I'm going to use a 3. 3 is going to ensure that it's going to slide through with relative ease. It's not going to deflect too much, and as most importantly, it's not going to burn away too much material. Burning away excess material is just simply going to make your cut thinner than 1 inch. It's then going to make it troublesome to replicate that cut going forward. Speaking of replicating, I think it's very important that you cut the amount of material that you're going to need for a given project. It's really difficult to go back and start recutting or resetting the guide to the exact quantity that I have here. So I'm just going to go ahead and make sure I cut the number of strips that I need. Once it's all set and you feel you're ready to begin, go ahead and flip it on and start running your strips through. It's pretty easy. You'll know if it's set correctly because it'll start sliding through like butter. You won't have any deflection and your cut will be relatively straight. You're just going to rinse and repeat this cut until you have the known strips, and then when that's all done, we'll set that material aside and get ready for the next step. The next part of the process involves cutting the actual depth of each of the tiles. It's arbitrary in terms of which depth you use, and it will depend on your particular project. For this project here, I'm using around a 3 to 4 mil depth. I just reset the glide slide here and then ran the same pieces that I cut in the previous step back through the blade. Again, just feed it through nice and slowly. You want to make sure that you get both an even top and bottom. We're then going to do a little bit of weathering to these, so it's important that you don't cut them too thin because they won't stand up to the weathering process. Because this is a floor, it's going to want to set level or nearly level to your tabletop. If it's overly thick, you're going to have to build up an artificial depth just to get up to the floor, and it's going to start looking unnatural. You can see here that I'm feeding it through, and I'm just using my fingers to walk it through. It lifted up a few times here, but because it's pressing against the glide slide, you're able to get away with that. With the strips now cut to the tile depth, we're now able to actually cut the tiles for the floor. For this, again, we're going to use the 1-inch by 1-inch as our starting point, and then what we're going to do is we're going to bisect that down by half. So then we're going to cut a 1-inch by 1/2 inch, and then ultimately ending up with 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. This is a pretty easy process. Again, if you are working with hand tools or at this point you wanted to switch and wanted to cut these by hand, it's very simple for you to do. You simply just need to lay your gauge on or create a little bit of a gauge and then start cutting them at 1-inch markings. This will effectively end up with a bulk number of 1-inch by 1-inch squares, of which then we can decide how much of each quantity we want to do moving forward. Again, I'm going to move back to the glide slide here and I'm going to reset the gauge. Again, 1 inch using that known quantity of the ruler. It becomes very easy and incredibly simple to run through as many tiles as I want. Now you may ask why not do this at the other stage while we were cutting 1 inch. You certainly could. I just simply like the manipulation of the foam at this level easier than cutting a large block, which then I have to bisect through at the 3 mil depth. It's a lot less cutting if I do it now than it was if I were to reverse the stages. Really, truthfully, it doesn't matter at this point. It's whatever you feel most comfortable with. This is my method, so this is where I feel most efficient. If you find another method or an alternative format to doing this, you certainly could. You're going to notice here that there's two ways to run these through. I can run through the tiles if they're horizontal like this, so stacked up like layers of a cake. I can also invert it and run it through on edge. The reason I don't like this is you're going to see that there's a massive amount of deflection that can occur. It's hard to put systematic pressure across each of the layers, and so I find it's a lot easier to downward press and then press it into the glide slide. This is certainly my preferred method. You can also back it with either a foam strip or a ruler, and you're going to see that I show both of these methods. I'm just showing this for the video. However, I typically just find that hand manipulation is the easiest. I will show you what happens when you press it through with the ruler. When you press it through with the ruler, one thing you have to note is that it's actually going to stop when it gets to the ruler, and you can't systematically slide it all the way through. Certainly, you can use whatever method works best for you. However, just doing it by hand, you're going to see here, it's a pretty efficient process. You're able to push them through. The tiles stay nicely stacked together, and before long, you're going to have yourself quite a stack of tiles that we can then use for the next steps going forward. If 1 inch by 1 inch is where you want to stop, then you're pretty close to being ready to apply these to the actual surface. As I said, I'm going to cut this down into a more of a cobblestone type pattern. It's going to fit together geometrically, and it's going to give a pretty cool end result. So we'll get to that process here in a moment. With the tiles now cut, it's time to make some decisions around the design. For your project, you may differ in terms of what quantity you use and which sizing yet you use. For me, I'm going to set aside some stacks here. These are going to remain as my 1 inch by 1 inch tiles. The remaining quantity, I'm going to split them in half, and then a smaller portion of those I'm then going to split into quarters. Certainly by splitting a small quantity into quarters, I'm going to actually end up with more of those than I do end up with the half portions, which is perfectly fine. I'm going to use all of them in the format, and the really neat thing is that I'm able to basically create any design I want, and it's going to stay relatively square and follow that 1 inch by 1 inch pattern. If that works for your game system or perhaps your role-playing game, I think the 1 inch by 1 inch will really lend well to a variety of formats. It's also very nice in terms of scale sizing. Certainly if you're using a smaller scale, it may be large. If you're using a larger scale, it may be small, but it does kind of split the difference and it creates a nice happy balance. In order to do this, what I need to do is move my gauge from the 1 inch section here, and I'm just going to move it down to roughly around a ½ inch. If you're not precise on this, or it's a little bit off one way or the other, you don't have to despair here. You're going to be able to make sure and make that distance up when you are actually gapping and putting this down. You are going to want to have some gaps between your tiles just to kind of give that stone look. You'll also notice here that I'm able to stack up a variety of heights. You don't want to go too high because, again, deflection is a thing. However, a couple stacks here, about 10 tiles thick, is perfectly fine. I'm using the same temperature here, that 3, and I'm just pressing them through, and again, ending up with 2 stacks now of ½ inch by 1 inch tiles. They'll stay together, and certainly you can use the heat of the blade to melt them a little bit. You want to make sure your blade temperature is not too high here, because if you do, you're going to burn away a lot of the material, and then that's going to ultimately impact your end design. So it's a really quick process here. It's really easy to get those tiles very efficiently through the blade. The ½ inch ones are now set aside. Now I'm moving over to the other stack that I've set aside to do the quarters. You'll notice here that I'm just placing them back together. Make sure they are square when they go through. Again, you can use the glide slide here, press them up against that, and then run them through. Keeping the ½ inch thickness, I don't need to change the blade here. I'm going to go ahead and run these through. I'm going to show you how efficient you can be in terms of putting 4 stacks together, keeping equal pressure on, running them through. It's going to be a pretty easy slide through. Again, make sure that you aren't using a lot of speed here. You're going to notice if you go too fast, sometimes this can happen. There you go. Now we had a snap in the blade because I went too fast. This is partially because the tension on the wire was too much. It's also partially because the wire has a tendency to become brittle after prolonged use. Breaking the wire here is not a problem, and in fact, you use very little wire when you're doing this. I've had this Proxxon cutter for some time now, and I've used very little. My previous Proxxon cutter I had for several years, and I never used the entire spool that it came with. So this is just a natural part of using the Proxxon cutter. I'll show you in live time how quickly it is to fix. You take the tension off, you open up the bottom spool, you feed the wire down through, tighten the tensioner, make sure you got a good hold. If you don't, just loosen it again, readjust it, pop it in, give it a tug, make sure you got a good fit, retighten the spool at the top, and you're ready to go. Please ensure that you turn your Proxxon cutter off when you do this. It's not going to hurt you until you actually reconnect the wire, but at that point it is going to heat up and potentially could be a problem for your fingers. Once that's reattached, just give it a turn back on, and then you can continue through the same process. I'm going to recut those ones that I just ran through, and we're going to cut them down into the quarter sections. Now with the half sections ready to go, we're just going to break them apart as the heat has solidified them together just slightly. We're now going to put these in stacks. Again, you can run them through as many sections as you want. A couple at a time is efficient. The smaller the piece, I feel that less you want to run through, just because there's more moving parts with many more layers. Once they're set, fire up your cutter and then run them through. Just be careful of your fingers as you are working with smaller and smaller pieces, and your fingers do get closer to the blade. As you can see, you run them through, they stay in the nice stacks, and now we've systematically created around 20 tiles per pass through the blade. It doesn't take a long time to get to a pretty enormous amount of tiles. However, you'll be quite surprised the amount you'll use. You will use quite a few. This will be more than double what we need, but I just wanted to make sure that I had enough for future projects, or if I want to do another tutorial next month using the same process. This next portion of the build is quite interesting. In fact, it's so interesting I can't even do it on camera. It's not because it's a trade secret, but it's simply just too loud to record. But I will describe what I'm going to do. So here I have a box of rocks. The rocks are then going to be shaken vigorously. But before I do that, I'm actually going to throw all of the tiles that we've previously cut. The 1 inch, the ½ inch, and the 1/4 inches are all going to be sprinkled in here. You'll notice that I'm actually breaking them up as I put them in. The rocks will do a pretty good job of this, but it's a lot easier if you do break up the bulk of the tiles. You don't have to have every single one individually divided. That will occur by the natural process. What the rocks are going to do is they're actually going to bang and thrash against the tiles. We're looking for two things to occur. One, we're looking to abrade the surface and give it kind of a more beaten and weathered look. And two, we're looking to round the corners. This is going to take about 3 to 4 minutes of shaking. I recommend doing it outside. You will have a little bit of dusted forms. This is why I'm using a lid. Make sure your lid is properly secured. Head to a quiet place that's not going to be quiet anymore, or a place that's at least away from everyone else, so not to disturb them. You're going to shake it, like I said, using both an up and down fashion as well as a round and around. You don't want to go all in one direction because you want to make sure that you don't end up with a rhythmic flow where you're only getting weathering on one side of the foam. I'm showing you here what the pristine foam looks like. The pieces effectively go in like this, and then when we get back, I'm going to show you what they look like after the vigorous shaking. I've now given the rock box a shake for about 3 to 4 minutes. We've now sorted out the rocks and the tiles. You can see here under the close camera the exact effect that we've achieved. Here on the left we have the weathered one, and here on the right the pristine one. You can see both the color has changed. This is primarily due to the fact that they've been beaten with some dusty rocks, but you can also see that the corners are now rounded and the tops have some depressions in them. These depressions are designed to give it a more of a rock-like surface. Here under the close cam, I'll grab some of the smaller ones as well, and you can see a real similar effect has been achieved with the smaller ones. You can see from the process why the 3 mil was very important. If they were any smaller, the rocks would have actually snapped or cracked some of the pieces, and that wouldn't have been to our desired effect. Now what we're going to do is using another piece of 3 mil foam. We're actually going to use this as the base plate, and we're going to go ahead and start laying out our tiles. For this, you can really start your pattern anywhere. You can start on a diagonal, you can start in a corner, you can start in the middle. As long as you have a uniform position to start from and you have an idea of what you want your pattern to look like, there's really no rhyme or reason as to where you need to start. For purposes and simplicity of the tutorial, I'm just going to start in the corner by gluing down one of the tiles. I'm going to use Weld Bond, and I am going to start with a 1-inch tile just to give myself a little bit of a reference point for the ones going forward. You'll see me use a variety of application techniques. I can apply it right to the tile. I can apply it onto the actual surface. I can apply it in large globs and move it around. I can also thin it out considerably. It's really up to you how you want to do this. As long as it stays secured, you should have no real true issue. The Weld Bond is secure enough and it has enough grip that I can immediately start placing additional tiles next to the ones that I've laid down. I like to use a dry fit just to sort of establish my pattern initially, and then after this I start moving into a little larger format and laying down several rocks at the same time. The application process is pretty redundant here, and we're going to use a variety of application techniques to put the stones down. Whether it's on the stone directly or directly onto the modular base, as I said, it doesn't really truthfully matter. Keep in mind though that as you put the glue onto the back of the stone, it will displace as you press it down. It will typically squeeze up between the crevices, and if you want to achieve really deep and maintain really deep crevices, you'll probably want to go a little bit more sparingly with the glue. If you're not interested in maintaining that and you want thick grout lines, you can certainly put more glue down. If you want a variety, then use a variety of techniques. It's pretty straightforward. When you do, and if you are applying ink later, it will absorb in various ways, whether there's a physical gap or a gap that's maintained with the glue. You're just going to want to keep in mind that there will be some variety and variation in terms of the absorption of that. For this process here, you can see that I'm using an actual foam substrate. Sometimes I use MDF, and most typically I'll use Plasticart or polystyrene, although the foam is perfectly fine and quite durable. If you're going to go on both sides of this, it's certainly not typical for a floor. However, I can invert this quite easily and use it as a wall. And so the variety of materials that you use is just really going to vary based on the application of this. Because I'm using it for a tutorial and because I wanted to keep it lightweight and not have to cut any MDF, I just chose to go with the foam. It's certainly fine, especially if you were to later glue this to a more substantial substrate. The process, as you can see here, is just me dry fitting, applying glue, laying in the stones, varying the pattern as I go through. If something doesn't align, just give it a quick little push. If you have a tool on hand, something that's square, it's really nice to kind of keep checking your first corner, reminding that you did work quite quickly, and so nothing has had a chance to fully adhere or solidify. I always like to work kind of while it's wet, and I'll have the ability to manipulate because I'm doing that. I'm just going to go ahead and speed up the process. Last few tiles here, and you'll notice that I've covered the entire area with glue. I start by setting in the 1-inch tiles because I feel that they're the best for referencing. I like them because they take up a lot of real estate and they really help determine the stones that go around it. I try not to replicate the pattern or have any real uniform look to the pieces, but certainly your design may want to have a little bit more pattern. The 1-inch tile surrounded by a border of 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch would look pretty neat. For this particular one, I'm trying to use a varied stone pattern, and again, flipping the stones vertically and horizontally. Occasionally you'll run into an area where one of the stones won't particularly fit, even though they are all cut to a standardized shape. This is probably primarily due to the rock process where we've weathered them and beat them down. If you want to cut them, that's fine, but you're going to want to re-weather the edge that you cut. So typically what I'll do is I'll just try to find a stone that fits better. Manipulating the gap between them is another clever technique that you can use to take up space, and that's something that I often use. You can see here that around the edge I do have a little bit of trimming to do. I'm going to let that fully solidify, run that back through the cutter, and really cut along that edge. Again, if I end up having to cut or trim one of the edges, it may require a little bit more weathering. You can simply do that by rubbing one of the stones directly onto your floor tile. Here I'm just tipping it up to indicate that this can not only be a floor, but it also could be a wall. This wouldn't be the typical pattern I'd choose for a wall, but I did want to show you that there's a variety of applications for this process, not only for floors, but you can do them for walls, you could do them for archways, you could do them for bridge bottoms. There's a variety of things that you could do with this cobblestone pattern. With the floor now dry, it's time to apply our protective layer. For this, I'm going to be using a combination of acrylic paint mixed with Mod Podge at a ratio of 2 parts paint to 1 part Mod Podge. I've gone ahead and mixed that mixture here in this plastic container. I'm going to be applying it with an old brush, something that I don't care that gets damaged. I'll probably throw it out in the end, to be perfectly honest. You can see here from the mixture that it is quite viscous, and as a result, it provides quite a bit of sealant. We'll actually be applying this in 2 layers, but we'll have a small step in between each layer. For this, I take a little bit of the Mod Podge and start. I'm paying close attention to actually jam it down in between the tiles as much as possible. You'll notice that I apply it and then I go around each side of each subsequent tile. Again, just trying to get all the various angles and crevices covered. If you're not perfect with this, you'll probably pick it up in the next prime layer or the next layer of Mod Podge. But most importantly, try to jam it down in there and try to fill some of the cracks and crevices. This is going to help solidify the tile a little bit stronger. It's going to make sure that it's a little less flexible. You're going to notice here that I'm going to actually flex the wall, or the floor rather, and you're going to see that it does have some flex. Once we get these applied, it's going to stiffen that up considerably. Considering this is a floor and not a wall, it is going to lay perfectly flat and probably be adhered to another surface, so the flexibility of this is not that important. However, for a wall, you may want to stiffen it up, particularly if it only has one side exposed. The Mod Podge itself is going to go on and it's going to be a bit streaky. I am using a brush, but I am not worried about brush strokes at this point. In the second layer, I'll probably use a little bit of a tamping technique and probably switch to a foam brush just to get a little bit less of a streaky finish. However, I'm not as concerned, as we're going to be creating some depressions in between using a tinfoil ball. That tinfoil is going to actually press through this first layer, and this is the reason that I do the second layer afterwards. So in case I create any pink cracks or crevices, I can easily account for that in the next layer. So here you can see I've just about finished up the painting. I just have this small corner left. We'll certainly allow this a few hours to dry before we come back, and you can see that there is a little bit of streak and brush strokes on here. Again, nothing that we need to be overly concerned with. One of the things you're also going to notice is that some of the cracks and crevices have started to disappear, or at least be diminished in quantity. This is because the Mod Podge actually acts as a gap filler. I really like it, particularly for walls. A lot of people will do some stucco finishes, whether with baking soda and glue or sand and glue. I actually think that this mixture itself does a pretty darn good job at covering a lot of that. The more layers, the more you will diminish the cracks and crevices. So if you don't want to have any modified or muted cracks, then perhaps one layer is where you want to stop. Certainly if you want to mute those down, or even if you want to fill them in considerably, you can just keep adding subsequent layer of this mixture before you actually do your base layer of paint. Each subsequent layer of paint is also going to help you with that. Also keep in mind, if you're going to do a wash or inking of any kind, if you've diminished all your cracks, you are actually going to not have much area to define. If you want to have any definition, I recommend leaving a little bit. You can always go in with a pen or pencil and retrace some of the lines, or at least make a few of them pronounced. And so that's something you can definitely do if in fact you filled them in prematurely, or if you end up having an undesired result at the end of the sealant layer. In addition to the adhesive properties provided by the Mod Podge layer, it also adds another layer of protection. For this project, we're going to be using some Vallejo acrylic matte sealer sprayed from an aerosol can. Typically, I won't recommend using aerosol with any foam projects, as it creates pocketing, pitting, and often can lead to an undesired look. However, with the Mod Podge layer added, you can actually go ahead and spray adhesives or aerosol finishes over this project without fear of damaging the project. Although I recommend doing multiple layers, one layer is sufficient. With the first protective layer now dried, we're going to come back in, and in between the layers, we're going to lay down a little bit more of a weathering. For this, we're using some aluminum foil. We're going to roll it into a loose ball, or you can roll it into kind of a hockey puck or a pancake. And we're just going to go ahead and start pressing it into the foam. You can use a variety of techniques. You can either directly kind of sponge or stipple it on there. You can also get it into more of a ball and then start rolling it along with your fingers, or in fact you can actually use the palm of your hand and then just start rolling it over as if you're kind of rolling out pizza dough or something similar. Some people have stamps for this, or maybe they'll make a gauge or a jig for this. I find I just make a new piece of aluminum foil every single time. As you're rolling it over, as I said previously, you may crack or indent the black foam and expose some of the pink surfaces. If you do, all you simply have to do is just make sure that you account for that in your second layer of foam. You can see here, I've just gone ahead and pressed it in and made a little indentation there. So in my second layer of Mod Podge, what I'm about to do, I'll just make sure that I focus in on those areas. You can see here now that I've sort of stippled on a different texture, and then when we go ahead and lay down the gray paint and subsequent layers of weathering and inks, that will really accent those areas. Thanks for watching this month's terrain tutorial. This is going to conclude this month's how-to. I know in this how-to we really focused in on the construction process and didn't get to the finished product. However, it was intentional. Next month we're going to be using this as our palette and our starting point as we transition this stone floor into a fall scene. Later we're going to show you how to convert that into an early winter or a late spring. We're going to use this as our palette as we take it forward. However, if you're emulating any of these styles, you can certainly change the color as well as the variations in terms of the products that we use. I'm going to be showing you how to use a number of pigments and powders, as well as some inks and standard paint colors. Hopefully you guys are able to replicate this, or at least get to this starting point, or perhaps you have a project that's very similar and this is actually already in line with something that you're working on. Nonetheless, we'll see that in the coming weeks, and I really appreciate your patronage. Stay tuned and have fun.